The Secret of the Old Mill, Chapter 12, Seasick. The Hardy boys were not prepared for this sudden change of front on the part of the stranger. They gazed incredulously at the revolver, but the coldly determined face of their passenger convinced them that the man meant to use the force if necessary. "Keep right on towards Bayport," he ordered. "Don't turn back." "What's the big idea?" demanded Frank indignantly. "The idea is that I want to go to Bayport, and if you won't take me there of your own free will, I'll just have to persuade you. That's all. This gun is loaded, so don't make any foolish moves." The boys looked at one another, and the stranger began to chuckle. "Be reasonable now," said the man with the gun. "I have to catch that train, or I'll miss the wedding. I can't let you bring me back to the village. My friends would never let me hear the end of the joke. It's just by luck I had this revolver in my pocket, but still, if you turn this boat around, I'll use it." He was trying to pass the affair off as more or less of a joke, but there was no mistaking the steely glint in his eyes or the hardness of his voice. Frank looked at his brother and shrugged. "I guess there's nothing else for it but bring him to Bayport," he muttered. "I don't want to get shot." "That gun looks bad," agreed Joe. "There's not much joking about that part of it." Frank bore down on the wheel and corrected the course of the boat, so that they were soon bound directly for Bayport again. "We'll take you to the city," he said to the stranger, "but I'm going to warn you that we'll turn you over to the police if we get a chance. That's a dangerous game you're playing. Even if you say it's only a joke, it's a hold-up." "You'll think differently after we reach Bayport," promised the man. "I'll have my wife write you a letter of thanks after the wedding. I hate to use this revolver, but I can't miss that train." The stranger's insistence on his story that he had to catch a train did not convince the Hardy boys by any means. They were still suspicious of their passenger, the more so now that he used force to induce them to take him to Bayport. "I'd like to get that gun away from him," whispered Frank as he bent over the wheel. "Not much chance. He's watching us too closely." "Trying to fix up some plot to get hold of this revolver?" asked the stranger. "You needn't bother. I hold the whip hand here." "We know it," retorted Frank. "But wait till we get to Bayport." The motorboat raced on down the bay. The storm clouds that had been collecting all morning now hung heavily in the sky. The bay was sullen and slate-colored, and a heavy sea was running. Whitecaps broke on the surface of the water. "Looks like a storm," Frank muttered. "Perhaps it's just as well we didn't turn back." A streak of lightning split the sky. It was followed by a distant rumble of thunder. The sleuth was riding the waves well, but there was a rocking motion that could not be avoided. The boat swayed from side to side as it plunged on. After about 5 minutes, Frank glanced behind him. The stranger was no longer standing up. He was sitting back against the cushions again, and he still held the revolver levered at the boys. But there was a curious expression on his face, an expression of nausea. His eyes were staring, and his face was pallid. For a moment Frank could not understand what the matter was, and then, as the boat gave a lurch more violent than usual, he understood. He nudged his brother. "Getting seasick," he whispered. Joe glanced back, and when he saw that the stranger's florid face had changed in hues from a deep red to a greenish white, he knew that the motion of the boat was indeed taking its effect. He forebore an impulse to chuckle at their stranger's plight. "Give her a little more gas," ordered the stranger in a curious, feeble voice. "You're not going fast enough." He brandished the revolver threateningly. Frank obligingly increased the speed of the sleuth, but the rocking motion only became more pronounced. The stranger gulped, but he did not lower the weapon. "That's better," he said without enthusiasm. "I'm going to give him something to be seasick about," whispered Frank. Without warning, he suddenly bore down on the wheel and swung the motorboat about so that it was laying broadside to the waves. "Here, what's the matter?" asked the stranger. "Where are you going now?" "We're off our course. I'm heading in toward shore, a little more, so we can get out of the wind." This explanation satisfied the stranger, although it became speedily apparent that the new course did not. The sloop received the full force of the long rolls. The waves were not high enough to be dangerous, but the swells gave an undulating motion to the craft that swiftly increased the stranger's illness. "He's slipping," whispered Joe. Frank glanced back again. The stranger was indeed slipping. His teeth were tightly clenched. His face was most green. His expression was that of a man who is deathly sick. But he still clung to the revolver, and he still waved it feebly at the boys. "Head her in towards the bay," he demanded. "Do you want to make me sick?" "This'll fix him," said Frank. "Get ready." He bore down on the wheel again, and the sloop swung around at the right angle to her previous course. The abrupt swerving motion finished the stranger. With a groan he slumped forward in his seat and bowed his head on his arms. Joe sprang up. With one bound he reached the man with the gun. The stranger realized what was happening and struggled to his feet. He raised the weapon, but Joe struck out and dashed the revolver from his hand. It described a flashing arc and then fell into the water with a splash. Sick as he was, the man swung out viciously, and his fist caught Joe on the side of his face, staggering him. Joe quickly recovered himself and plunged forward, grappling with the man. They swayed to and fro in the middle of the boat, and then fell still struggling. But although Joe was young and wiry, he was not strong enough to cope with his antagonist, and Frank soon saw that the stranger was having the better of the battle. He glanced ahead and saw that the sloop was heading into a long, low bank of fog, but there were no other boats in sight. Then abandoned the wheel. He leapt back to the assistance of his brother, crooked his elbow about the stranger's neck, and dragged him back. The man struck out wildly, twisted around, and staggered Frank with a blow in the ribs. He managed to struggle to his feet. They saw his hand flash to his pocket, and then he produced a small package and flung it far out over the side. It had only taken a second, but that second was sufficient to serve for his undoing. Frank scrambled to his feet in swaying boat, and for a moment they sparred. Then Frank's right fist shot out, and the blow landed directly on the point of the stranger's jaw. The man was not knocked out, but he staggered back, and the wild lurching of the boat sent him off his balance. He stumbled and fell. His head struck against the side of the boat, and he crumpled up in a heap. The blow had knocked him unconscious. Frank bent over him. He saw that the man was not badly hurt, but that he had been stunned by the impact. He pointed out a coil of rope in the stern. "Tie his ankles, Joe, in case he wakes up. I've got to get back to the wheel." The sloop by this time was off her course and was wallowing in the trough of the waves. Quickly Frank swung the craft about, but when he peered ahead to locate Bayport, he gave an exclamation of alarm. The city was nowhere to be seen. The heavy cloud of mist that had been gathering over the bay now totally obscured the shores. How far the boat had departed from her course he did not know, and in the fog bank he had but a vague idea of their location. He began to look around in hopes of finding a compass, but there was none in the boat. "Have you got a pocket compass, Joe?" Joe, who was busily engaged in tying the unconscious stranger's ankle together, looked up and shook his head. "Isn't there one in the boat?" "No, and here we are in the fog bank. I don't know whether we're in the right direction for Bayport or not." Chapter 13. Paul Bloom. Frank Hardy reduced the speed of the motorboat because he realized the danger that lurked in the fog. Almost any moment they might crash into another boat in the bay. Even worse, they might be so far off their course that they would pile up on one of the rocky shores. The fog was impenetrable. Frank did his best to judge their direction by the waves, but this did not help greatly, as there were cross currents and the wind was shifting. The sloop coursed on, feeling its way blindly through the haze that enveloped the bay. Frank peered ahead into the foggy veil. Joe concluded his ministrations to the stranger, who was now beginning to stir. The man opened his eyes and groaned. "Have you had enough?" asked Joe. "Who hit me?" "You hit your head against the side of the boat. Are you going to make any more trouble?" The man groaned again, tried to get to his feet, found his ankles were tied together, and sank back with a sigh. "He won't give us any more bother," declared Joe, coming forward. It was plain that there was no more fight left in their captive. "I wish this fog would lift," said Frank, as though in answer to his words a sudden gust of wind sent the mist in scurrying wreaths, raising the heavy gray veil long enough to enable him to see Bayport laying almost directly ahead. He did make out a position of the row of boat houses, and he headed the sloop towards them. The curtain of fog descended again, but Frank was now fairly sure of his position. "We're heading in the right direction now. Should we try and make to the boathouse? I don't think we'll be able to find it in this mist." "I guess you're right. We'll land at the big wharf." In a short while the boat was nosing its way through the fog among the shadowy crafts anchored near Bayport Wharf. The city loomed up in a ghostly dark mass beyond the water. Finally the sloop drew alongside the wharf and nosed its way to one of the slips. To the surprise of the boys, they saw several figures running along the wharf. "What boat is that?" shouted someone from the fog. "The sleuth." "Good. That's them. I thought they'd land here," said the voice, evidently addressing someone else on the wharf. "Looks as if we're expected," observed Joe. A man came down the slip, and even in the fog they knew the figure was familiar. When he drew closer, they saw that the man was none other than their father. "Dad!" exclaimed Frank. "Have you got him with you?" asked the detective quickly. "Who, Joe?" No. The man you picked up at Barmet Village. I had a telephone message about him." "Yes, we have him here. He tried to hold us up with a revolver, but we got the better of him." "Fine," said Mr. Hardy, peering down into the boat where the stranger was struggling to sit up. "All right, Chief," he called to a burly man who was coming down the slip. "They have him." Chief Collig of Bayport Police Force and Con Riley, one of his men, then appeared in view. "Got him, eh?" said Collig. "They have him here in the boat." "All right, hand him over." Still wondering how their father had known that the stranger was in the boat with them, and wondering also why the police were on the hand, the Hardy boys untied the ropes that bound their stranger's ankles and helped him over the side. He was immediately seized by the officers, who proceeded to search his pockets. "Here," he protested, "what's all this about?" "Well, Paul Bloom," said Fenton Hardy, "you thought you'd made a getaway, didn't you?" The man started. "You have my name wrong," he muttered. "Oh, no, I haven't," contradicted Mr. Hardy. "They tell me that you were shoving the odd money down in Barmont Village this morning." The Hardy boys had been told by their father that shoving odd money was the underworld expression for passing counterfeit money. "Those Secret Service men would have caught you if the boat hadn't been handy," went on Fenton Hardy. He turned to his sons. "What sort of story did this fellow tell you?" "He said he had to catch a train, as he was going to be married, and some of his friends in the village were trying to hold him back as a practical joke," answered Frank. "We thought the yarn was rather fishy, and I was going to turn back, but he drew a revolver on us." "How did you get him tied up?" "We got him seasick. Joe knocked the gun out of his hand, and then we tackled him." "Good work," approved Mr. Hardy. I got a phone call from 2 Secret Service men this morning. It seems they've been trailing Paul Bloom for some time, and they were just about to arrest him when he made a bolt for liberty. They chased him down the street, but he disappeared in your boat heading for Bayport. They waved at you and tried to signal to you to come back." "So that's why the 2 fellows were running alongside the shore," exclaimed Joe. "But when you didn't turn back, they telephoned to me to meet the boat and arrest him." Fenton Hardy turned to Chief Colleague. "Did you find anything?" he asked. The chief straightened up, scratching his head. "Not a thing. Nothing but a dollar bill and some matches." "No counterfeit money?" exclaimed Mr. Hardy in surprise. "Not a bit." "That's strange. The detective told me he had a big roll of bad bills." "Why, that must have been what he threw overboard," said Frank. "He took something out of his pocket and tossed it over the side of the boat while we were fighting with him at the time. I couldn't imagine what it was." "I guess that's how he got rid of it." Fenton Hardy turned to Paul Bloom, who was standing sullenly with his pockets turned inside out. "And what have you got to say for yourself, Bloom?" "Nothing. You haven't got anything against me." "Perhaps not just now, but wait till those Secret Service men arrive from Barmont. You were passing counterfeit money in the village." "Any counterfeit money I passed I got from someone else," blurted the prisoner. "I'm not in that game." Fenton Hardy turned to his sons. "This doesn't happen by any chance to be the fellow who tricked you on that bad $5 bill at the railway station, does it?" he asked. They shook their heads. "No, it isn't he. I'm convinced that he is associated with the gang in some way." "You haven't got anything on me," Bloom persisted doggedly. "Perhaps I did pass some bad money in the village. What of it?" "If I did, I didn't know it was bad. I got it from someone else. It ain't my fault." "If you're so innocent, why did you run from the detectives?" "I had to catch a train." "Tell that to the judge," advised Chief Colleague roughly. "I think I'll lock you up for a while, my friend, and let you just think things over." "You put him in the cooler," piped on Con Riley. "I didn't want any advice from you," said the chief, crushing his subordinate officer with a frown. "Here, put the cuffs on his bird and lock him up." There was a jingle of handcuffs as they were clapped about Paul Bloom's wrists. The man protested, but he was quickly silenced by the chief. "We're going to keep you until the Secret Service man get here." Chief Colleague and Constable Riley trudged off with Paul Bloom between them. Fenton Hardy turned to his sons with a smile of approval. "Good work," he said. "You haven't lost any time making good use of the new boat, I see." "I only wish we could have got hold of that roll of counterfeit bills he threw overboard," said Frank disconsolately. "Well, it can't be helped now, although that would have clinched the case against Bloom. He has been operating in this neighborhood for over a week, but I expect the Secret Service men will have enough evidence to have him punished." The fog was beginning to lift, and the Hardy boys had no further doubt of their ability to locate the boathouse. They felt they had enough of their motorboating for one morning, so they said good day to their father and left the wharf, guiding the sloop safely to the boathouse. "If every trip we have in the sleuth is as exciting as that one, we'll have no reason to kick," Frank remarked as he shut off the engine. Chapter 15. Con Riley Guards a Package. Officer Con Riley was at peace with the world. His heart was full of contentment, and his stomach was full of pie. The sun was shining, and one of the aldermen had just given him a fairly good cigar. His beat had been free of crime for a week. His wife had gone to the country for a visit, and she had taken the children with her. Hence Con Riley's feeling of deep and lasting satisfaction with the world. Even the boys, his natural and hereditary enemies, had not tormented him for several days. Perhaps, he argued, it was because they were up to their ears in work, preparing for examinations. If That was the reason Con Riley decided that examinations were good things and should be encouraged. As he sauntered along the shady side of Main Street, leisurely swinging his club and gravely responding to the greetings of "Good afternoon, officer," as he reflected that there were worse occupations in life than being on the Bayport police force, he was well content with his lot just then. He exchanged salutations with the traffic cop on the main corner and mentally congratulated himself because he was not a traffic cop. The job exposed one to all manner of weather, from cold, drenching rain to sizzling heat. No, he was just as glad he was on the beat. A troop of boys came down the street from the direction of the Bayport High School, and Riley instinctively stiffened. If it were not for those confounded boys, life would be very different for him. They did not seem to appreciate the dignity of his position. They were always contriving schemes to make him look ridiculous. He spied the Hardy boys with their companions, and his frown deepened. Too smart altogether, those Hardy lads. They weren't mischievous, he had to admit that, but they were meddling in work of the police all too much. Already they had been credited too much in solving a couple of mysteries that he and Con Riley would certainly have solved alone, if he had been given a little more time. Then there was Chet Morton, a boy. He'd come to a bad end some day, that fellow. So would all the rest of them. Tony Prideaux, Phil Cohen, Jerry Gilroy, Biff Hooper, the whole pack of 'em. Still, Con Riley was in a good humor that afternoon, so he unbended sufficiently to bestow a nod of greeting upon the boys. To his surprise, they gathered round him. "What has been done with Paul Bloom?" asked Frank. "He's in jail," said Riley, with a portentous frown he always assumed when discussing matters of crime. "He's in jail, and in jail he'll stay." "Hasn't he been tried yet?" The constable shook his head. "Not yet. The rascal has a lawyer, and the case has been adjourned." "Not much doubt that he'll get a heavy sentence," remarked Chet, who was carrying beneath his arm a package wrapped in brown paper. "No doubt of it at all," agreed Riley. "Didn't you fellows tell me that Lieutenant Riley helped capture the counterfeiter?" asked Chet innocently, turning to the Hardy boys. Riley's chest expanded visibly when he heard himself referred to as lieutenant, and when it dawned on him that Chet thought he had a part in the actual capture of Bloom, he tried to look as modest as possible, although he did not succeed very well. "Oh, I helped, he said with a wave of the hand. "If it hadn't been for Officer Riley, the fellow might have got away," said Joe smoothly. "He slapped the handcuffs on Bloom in the neatest manner you ever saw. He was waiting for us right at the dock." Riley beamed. This was praise, however, undeserved, and he basked in the admiration of the boys. He told himself that he had perhaps been mistaken in his estimation of these lads after all. They were not mischievous young rascals, but bright, intelligent, high-minded boys who recognized human worth when they saw it, and who respected achievement. "Yes," he said heavily, "I got Bloom behind the bars, and he won't get out again in a hurry." He said it as though he had personally been responsible for Bloom's capture and personally responsible for seeing that the prisoner was kept safely locked up. "No, he won't get away on you, Lieutenant Riley," said Chet. Con Riley's opinion of Chet increased. The boy had mistaken him for a lieutenant. The mistake was natural enough, perhaps, but he would have to be corrected. "Officer," he pointed out sadly. "Not lieutenant. Officer." "Do you mean to tell me that you're not a lieutenant?" exclaimed Chet in well-assumed amazement. "Not yet," replied the officer, leaving the impression, however, that it was only a matter of hours before such promotion should be his in a natural course of events. Chet turned to his companions. "Can you imagine that?" he exclaimed. "There's the police force for you. They keep a solid, brainy man like Riley here on beat, and let fellows like Collig be chief. It's wrong. I tell you it's wrong." The boys gravely agreed that it was scandalous. "A man's just got to be patient," said Riley with the air of martyr, and beginning to feel ill-used. "There's a limit to patience," exclaimed Chet. "They're imposing on you, Mr. Riley. If I were you, I'd insist on my rights." "Never mind," said Riley darkly. "My turn will come." "You're just right, it will. And we'll see that it comes very soon. Let's try to stir up public opinion, fellows, and see if we can't influence the public a little bit. If the public demands that Officer Riley be promoted, he'll be promoted." "Why, that's very good of you," returned Riley pompously. "A few words in the right place mightn't do any harm at all." "Those words shall be said," Chet assured him earnestly. "You may depend on us, Mr. Riley. We will see that your qualities of leadership are recognized. You're the only man who can wake this city up." Con Riley, a trifle dazed by this avalanche of flattery, but nevertheless feeling that every bit of it was deserved, and that the boys deserved credit for their perception, beamed with appreciation. "Why, I never had no idea you lads felt like this," he said. "I always thought you had sort of a grudge against me." The boys immediately disclaimed any such sentiments. "We may have been a little bit troublesome at times," agreed Chet regretfully. "But that was because we didn't understand you. After this, you may depend on us. Your time will come, Mr. Riley. Your time will come." With this fine oratorical effort, Chet produced the package from beneath his arm. "By the way," he said, "I wonder if you wouldn't mind guarding this package for me, Mr. Riley? You'll be here for the next 10 minutes, won't you?" A doubt flashed across Riley's mind. "Why don't you friends look after it? We're all going to be together, and we didn't care to wait. If a man by the name of Muggins comes along and asks for it, you'll give it to him, will you?" Riley took the package. "I'll take care of it," he promised. "I wouldn't trust it with anyone but you," declared Chet solemnly. "You can trust me. I'll look after it, and if your friend Muggins comes along, I'll see that he gets it safely all right." Chet thanked Riley warmly, and the boys hastened off and disappeared round the next corner. Riley, with the package under one arm, leaned against a post, and thought well of himself and of the world in general. He completely revised his opinions of the boys, and particularly of Chet Morton, whom he now regarded as an exceptionally intelligent lad who would make his mark in the world. Riley was glad that he was able to be of service to Chet by minding the package for him. The package was not very heavy. Riley was curious as to its contents. Chet had left the impression that it contained something quite valuable. He said he would not trust anyone but Riley to guard it. That in itself was a compliment. The late afternoon was warm, and as Con Riley leaned against the post and indulged in these pleasant meditations, permitting himself to speculate on what the boys had said about his fitness for promotion, allowing himself to remember how pleasant it had sounded to hear Chet refer to him as lieutenant, he became a bit drowsy. He was naturally a sleepy man, and he had long since schooled himself in the art of appearing to be wide awake while on duty, while indulging in covert naps of a few minutes' duration. The hurrying crowds of people behind him, because it was the 5 o'clock rush hour, gradually became a blurred impression of trampling feet and chattering voices. Suddenly the shrill jangle of an alarm clock sounded. Riley started violently, straightened up, blinked, and looked behind him. The alarm clock trilled steadily. Riley looked suspiciously at the people nearby, and the people looked at one another. He looked up into the air, looked down at the pavement, but still the mysterious alarm clock rattled on. Then Riley became aware that the alarm clock was in the package under his arm. At the same time, the crowd became aware of the fact as well. Someone tittered. Someone else laughed outright. "Carry your own alarm clock with you now, do you?" asked the man. Riley felt very foolish. He was tempted to throw the package away, but instead he held it gingerly by the string and pushed his way through the crowd. The unremitting alarm clock rang loudly. "Time to wake up," shouted a wit in the crowd. Riley flushed and hastened on down the street, but the alarm clock shrilled relentlessly. That tinkling bell seemed as though it would ring forever. And as Riley hurried on his way, people turned and stared and laughed. The small boys began to follow him, while all the time the bell trilled on without a sign of weakening. His journey down the street was a triumphant procession. The crowd of small boys following him swelled to proportions of a parade. The bell rang on. Con Riley was the center of interest. He did not know what to do. If he threw away the package now, it would be an admission that he had been the victim of a practical joke. The longer he kept the package, the more the crowds laughed, and the louder the bell seemed to ring. His steps became faster and faster, and though he were trying to run away from the sound, everyone was staring at him in amazement. The giggles and goughs of the crowd became louder. The shouts of the small boys were more insistent. Across Con Riley's mind flitted certain phrases of Chet Morton. "Your time will come. You're the only man who can wake this city up. We shall see that your qualities of leadership are recognized." With a mutter of wrath, he flung the tinkling package into the nearest alley. An uninformed street cleaner who was just emerging from the alley received the package full in the chest and sat down very suddenly. He flung the package back at Riley, and the crowd whooped with glee. The package fell into the street, the bell still ringing, and one of the small boys picked it up and ran after Riley, asking if he wanted it back. Thus he was pursued to the police station until the bell of the alarm clock ceased to ring, and only then did the crowd scatter. Mopping his brow, flushed with anger, Riley took refuge in the station and vowed vengeance in the future on all the boys in Bayport, particularly high school boys, most especially Chet Morton's gang, and most absolutely and positively Chet Morton himself. As for that worthy, in company with his chums, he had witnessed the alarm clock parade from a convenient corner across the street, and was now limply making his way towards the Hardys' barn, pausing every now and then to burst into shrieks of laughter at the remembrance of Riley's undignified flight. But when the Hardy boys and their chums reached the house, they found their father hastening down the front steps. "I just had a telephone message from the police station," he said. "What's the matter?" asked Frank, while the other lads looked at one another guiltily. Had Riley reported them? "Paul Bloom has escaped from jail," said Fenton Hardy.